So President Kennedy has given his speech. He's made it real clear what the American actions are going to be in this crisis. And he's also allowed the Soviet Union to know that we know about the missiles in Cuba and the missile launching pads. So early in the morning on October 23rd, XCOM gets together and meets again. Now keep in mind the President has not officially put the quarantines into place, right? He just informed the American people that he was going to. But there's a few other things he wants to figure out before he does it, right? He does not want another Bay of Pigs, right? So one of his biggest concerns the morning of Tuesday, October 23rd, is that if these Soviet ships reach the quarantine line and refuse to comply, what are we going to do? And so Bobby Kennedy asks Admiral George Anderson, this fellow right here, he asks Admiral Anderson to please step up and explain to XCOM what the procedures were going to be when these ships reach the quarantine line. What do we call these procedures or steps? The rules of engagement. What are the rules of engagement? So Admiral Anderson briefs XCOM on what the rules of engagement will be once these Soviet ships, and how many are coming? Come on, 26. Yep, 26 are coming. And what's going to happen at the quarantine line once they get there? Here are the rules of engagement as explained by Admiral Anderson. Step 1. Prior to these ships reaching the quarantine line, the United States Navy will make radio contact with them using American sailors fluent in Russian, and basically explain to them that they are to stop. Okay? So the first step of the rules of engagement at the quarantine line will be that the Navy will make radio contact with the approaching ships using American sailors fluent in Russian to let them know what their expectations are at the line. Step 2 in the rules of engagement will be these Soviet ships would be ordered to reduce speed and stand by for inspection. Step 2 in the rules of engagement is the Soviet ships would be expected to reduce speed and stand by for inspection. Step 3, a Navy inspection team would board the Soviet vessel and do what? Search it for offensive weapons. Step 3 would be a naval inspection team would board the Soviet ship and search the vessel for offensive weapons. And step 4 was kind of a two-part thing. If they searched the ship and didn't find any offensive weapons, what would happen? The ship would be allowed to go through. If they indeed did find offensive weapons on the ship, what would happen then? The ship would be ordered to turn around and go back to the Soviet Union. So those were the rules of engagement that Kennedy was curious about once the Soviet ship reached the quarantine line. There would be an attempt by the United States Navy to make radio contact using American sailors speaking in Russian. That would be step 1. Step 2 is the Soviet ships would be ordered to reduce speed and stand by for inspection. Step 3 is a naval inspection team would board the Soviet ship and search the vessel. And step 4, if they find offensive weapons, they would be turned back. If they did not find offensive weapons, they would be allowed to continue to Cuba. That were the rules of engagement. Well, after Admiral Anderson got done explaining that, Bobby Kennedy then asked him, what's going to happen if the Soviet ships refuse to be searched? They stop, but they refuse to be searched. And Admiral Anderson's response, that if the Russian ships refuse to be searched, they would be towed into the nearest port. So Bobby Kennedy's question would be, okay, now what happens if we get these ships to stop and they refuse to be searched? And Admiral Anderson said, if they refuse to be searched, we will tow them into the nearest port. What would they do when they towed them into the nearest port? They would search them. Yeah. Okay? Bobby's next question is, well, what are we going to do if they simply run the blockade? They don't stop, they don't heed our warning, they just run the blockade. Admiral Anderson said there would be a two-step rules of engagement process in that scenario. Step one, if they refused to stop and simply ran the blockade, is the Navy would shoot a warning shot across the bow of the ship. What would be the purpose of that, Andy? And make them stop, okay? Now, if that didn't work, if the ship ignored that warning shot, then step two would be they would fire at the ship's rudder, they would disable the ship, they would board the ship and inspect it. So when Bobby Kennedy said, well, what happens if they simply run the quarantine line or the blockade? He said the two-step rule of engagement there would be we would first fire a warning shot over their bow to get them to stop. If they ignored the warning shot, we will shoot out their rudder, we will board the ship and inspect it. At that point, because he knew what would happen, President Kennedy made it really clear. He stepped in the conversation, he said, there will be no firing on any Soviet ships without my explicit permission. The only person that's going to order any firing on any ships is going to be who? The President. He made that really clear because he knew if we fired upon the Soviet ship, what was going to happen? They're going to retaliate. Okay? So, when they get through that discussion, the next discussion among XCOM is the need for further spy plane missions. They need to further their surveillance, as Kennedy promised in his speech. They needed further spy plane missions. These were going to be different, though. How? How are these flights going to be different than the ones we've talked about? What? They're going to be over Cuba, but low-level flights on the ground. Low-level flights on the ground. Now, the reason they need to do the low-level flights is they got to get the best photographs possible of not only the missiles, but how far along the missile launching pads are. How close they are to becoming, whole word, operational. So they can't do it from up here, they need them on the deck. Okay? Now, do you remember what we talked about yesterday when President Kennedy said in his speech that the Soviets in Cuba were putting defense weapons in there? Missiles, anti-aircraft guns, those types of things to defend them against what? A possible airstrike and invasion. So they're defending themselves. So when these low-level flights come over Cuba, they're going to be shot at. Okay? They're going to be shot at. The chances of those flights being shot at are going to be really good. Now, what happens if they're shot at, Elisa? Who's going to want to respond? If our American pilots are in danger and they're shot at as we do these spy flights, who's going to want to respond? The military. And how are they going to respond? Force. And we're going to be right where Kennedy doesn't want to be. Now, despite all the dangers of these low-level flights, Kennedy agrees to allow them. Because he knows, and he's right, they got to have them. They got to know whether these missile launching pads are operational or not. They got to know, because once they're operational, what happens, Alexa? They can fire. We're really at big danger. Now, let me make a point right here, just so you know. This is the military's point. Once those missile sites become operational, this negotiation and this quarantine goes out the window. Once they can fire the weapon, we have to take them out. That's just the way it is. And the military's made that real clear to the President. Now, we're not at that pressure yet. We're going to get to that pressure where they're going to be having to make a decision, but we're not there yet. Now, Kennedy's decision to allow these low-level flights makes who very uncomfortable and nervous? Who? No, they're probably all for it. Kenneth O'Donnell. Very good. Because what's Kenneth O'Donnell's job? To keep the president out of what? Trouble. Okay? So these low-level flights really have O'Donnell concerned. He's very uncomfortable. You know what he's thinking? He gets the president aside and he says, this is a setup. You're getting set up here. You know that these planes are going to be fired upon. And when they're fired upon, the military is going to expect you to protect the pilots, and to do that you're going to have to engage the sites that fired upon these pilots, which are where? In Cuba. He said, you are getting set up here. It's clear to me that the military is setting you up. They know they're going to be fired upon. And they know that you're going to be forced to respond. Now, you think about this. Do the Russians and Fidel Castro know that we know about the missiles in Cuba? So all of a sudden, if planes are coming in on the deck, how do they know whether they're photography planes or warplanes? So they're going to respond. When they see the planes, they're going to fire on them. There's no question about it. And O'Donnell's just upset. He firmly states to President Kennedy, you know these planes are going to be shot at. And O'Donnell also knew that if the planes were fired on, it's going to be the president's responsibility to protect the pilots. And protecting these pilots is probably going to result in military airstrikes against the sites that shot at the airplanes. Which means we're right back to square one where Kennedy doesn't want to be. President Kennedy insists that I cannot do anything about this. I've got to let these flights go. So Kenneth O'Donnell knows that he needs to take care of this himself. He's got to keep the president out of trouble. He's got to keep the president from protecting the pilots. So you know what he does? He figures out who's flying the mission. 2 guys are flying the mission. And he calls the commander, William B. Ecker. And he talks to him personally. He's one of 2 pilots. He and Bruce Wellaby are going to be flying this low-level mission to get these photographs. It's going to be William B. Ecker and Bruce Wellaby. And what O'Donnell does is he calls and speaks to Ecker personally. He gets on the phone and he speaks to Commander Ecker personally. He'll be one of the 2 pilots and the pilot in command. And O'Donnell passes an order from President Kennedy to Commander Ecker. Anybody want to guess what that order is? Don't get shot at. Don't get shot down. Now, if you're Commander Ecker, what's your response to that order? What's that? Well, would you be a little confused? And you'd be making things like, well, I don't know what's going to happen out there. What do you mean, don't get shot at, or don't get shot down? And this is what O'Donnell said to him. He said, now, I've known the man for 15 years. The problem is he will protect you. So I am asking, don't make him protect you. Don't get shot at. That's what he told. Now, can you imagine what Ecker's thinking then? Okay? So, Ecker listens to O'Donnell. He and his partner in crime, so to speak, Lieutenant Bruce Wellaby, take off and begin their low-level flight over Cuba. And they are shot at. But they return successfully. Now, that doesn't mean there's not 20 or 40 millimeter holes in their wings, but they do not get shot down. But they get shot at, without question, and they complete their mission, and they land back at the air base. Now just listen to this, don't write it down yet. You should remember this. And as they land, both pilots get out, and the rest of the military is pretty impressed with the artillery they took. Man, look at that. Look at that, Commander. Damn bird strikes. Now, do you know what bird strikes are? They're a real thing. When you're flying an airplane and you get up there, if a flock of geese or some sorts of birds are migrating, they can hit your plane and cause serious damage, maybe even make it crash if they get in the engine and those types of things. But bird strikes can make holes in airplanes, or dents or holes. So he gets out, and as everybody's marveling about the tremendous 20 millimeter and 40 millimeter holes in the wings of both airplanes, Ecker gets out and he says to his men, "Damn bird strikes anyway." And one of the men said, "Well, are those 20 millimeter or 40 millimeter bird strikes, sir?" And he said, "Bird strikes, that's what it is." That's the end of the conversation. So what's he doing? He's protecting the president. He doesn't want the information out that they were shot at. And he does a pretty good job. Well, the problem is, he ends up calling Kenneth O'Donnell and saying, "You're not going to believe this. I've been asked to deliver this film personally to the Pentagon." That never happens. The pilot never delivers the film to wherever it's going to be developed. But he gets the call, he being Ecker, and they've asked him to come to the Pentagon personally and bring the film. So what does Ecker do? He calls O'Donnell. He says, "Hey, we got a problem here. They've told me personally, ordered me personally, to go to the Pentagon and deliver this film." What's O'Donnell know they're going to do? They're going to ask him what? Were you shot at? And then we got another problem. And O'Donnell again emphasizes, "I know this is against anything you've probably been taught in your military career, but don't make the president protect you. They're going to ask you if you've been shot at. You got to help us here. Make sure you weren't shot at." Okay? So, Ecker personally delivers the film to the Pentagon. There's a lot of military leaders there. And as soon as he gets there, this is what he was asked by General LeMay. General LeMay walked up to him and said, quote, "Son, I want to know just one thing. Those bastards shoot as much as a BB gun at you?" First question he asked him is whether he was shot at, right? So again, when Ecker personally delivered the film to the Pentagon, he was asked directly by General LeMay, "Son, I want to know just one thing. Those bastards shoot as much as a BB gun at you?" Now, what do you think his response is going to be? Because he's been asked by a superior officer if he's been shot at. What's he say? He can't say no because he's lying, right? Well, he could maybe throw the bird strike, but you think LeMay's buying that? No. So here's what his response is. Again, "Son, I want to know just one thing. Those bastards shoot as much as a BB gun at you?" His response was, "It was a cakewalk, sir." That's what he said. It was a cakewalk, sir. We've avoided another problem, okay? Now, thinking about Kennedy's speech the night before, what's one of the things he wants to get done towards the end of his speech? He wants to get support from who about our actions of quarantine in Cuba. Well, he already didn't get that. What? No, what? The Organization of American States, or the OAS. And so what Kennedy's doing is he's having a private conversation with Secretary of State Dean Rusk, and he's saying, "Dean, listen, they know what's going on, they know what our plan is, they're either going to vote support or not in support of our actions in Cuba. You got to get there and make sure every single one of them votes in support. I want a unanimous decision, a unanimous vote in favor of what we're doing in Cuba with the quarantine." And Dean Rusk says to the President, "Mr. President, there hasn't been a unanimous vote in the Organization of American States ever." He said, "I don't care, Dean, unanimous. You go get the unanimous vote. It's your job, go get it done. I need full support from the Organization of American States on our actions in Cuba concerning the quarantine. You go get me that unanimous vote." And Rusk again has made the comment, "Mr. President, there hasn't been a unanimous vote in the Organization of American States ever." Okay? Well, it just so happened that when that vote came in later that evening, it came back unanimous. Every single member of the Organization of American States voted in support of the actions the Americans were taking in Cuba. Now, what has Kennedy not done officially yet, though? He said he's going to do it, but he hadn't done it. Right. He has not officially put the blockade into place. So once the vote comes back unanimous at 7:06 p.m., he signs the proclamation 3504. So after receiving word that he had gotten full support of the Organization of American States, President Kennedy then signs into law Proclamation 3504, which officially does what? Officially authorizes the naval quarantine of Cuba. Now, once he signed it at 7:06 p.m., he made it known that it would go into effect officially at 10 o'clock the next morning, Wednesday, October 24th. So he signs it at 7:06 on the 23rd, and he states it will go into effect officially at 10 a.m. the next morning on Wednesday, October 24th. So the day's about over, right? But unfortunately, Kennedy gets two more pieces of bad news at the end of an already stressful day. What do you think the first bad news is? Very good. They developed those photographs, right, of the missiles and missile launching pads from those low-level flights, and those launching pads are becoming closer and closer to operational. Okay? So that's the first bit of bad news he gets. Is those new spy plane low-level flight photos are showing that the missiles are there, more defined, and that the missile launching pads are getting closer to operation. The second piece of bad news is just lack of common sense. There was a regularly scheduled hydrogen bomb test for that day. And it was going to be basically exploding a nuclear weapon in the South Pacific to test it. Now, Kennedy was very upset because they went ahead with that test. He would think that common sense would tell the military, hey, we're in a crisis here, maybe we ought to not